Today marks the 10th anniversary of the US invasion of Iraq, and almost on cue, there were a series of at least 10 coordinated car and suicide attacks that have left more than 50 people dead today and over 200 wounded. In the decade since the invasion in 2003, Iraq is neither a failed state nor a stable democracy. But the price in terms of American blood and treasure has been severe. Over 4,400 service members killed, 32,000 wounded, and at a cost of $800 billion, according to the Department of Defense. And of course, more than 100,000 Iraqis also lost their lives. Joining us now is Michael O'Hanlon, Director of Research and Senior Foreign Policy Fellow at the Brookings Institution. And here with me in New York is Jeremy Scahill, National Security Correspondent for The Nation and the author of Dirty Wars, which is due to publish next month. Mike, if I can start with you, the First Lady spent time today with veterans of the war. The President has issued a statement honouring those who paid the ultimate price. But has this become a war that Americans would prefer to consign to distant memory?
Hi, Martin. Well, I think the short answer is yes. I also very much appreciate your introduction and starting with remembering our veterans, because I think rather than this being seen as a day to commemorate either a victory or defeat, it's a day to commemorate the service of so many. Because, as you say, the costs have been enormous, and the costs are right before us. The costs have largely already been paid. The benefits, which I hope will ultimately be substantial, are nonetheless very fragile or provisional. A new Iraqi government, which at least is not run by a Hussein family member, but nonetheless is hardly a stable democracy, for example, and may or may not be contributing to the peace of the broader region. So whatever benefits we're going to have from the Iraq War are either hypothetical in the terms of what Saddam might have done if he had stayed in power, or very fragile in terms of where this new Iraqi government may be headed. But the costs are very real and very concrete. So it's, for me, more of a sad day than a happy day. But nonetheless, I hope over time Iraq will stabilize enough that we can someday have a serious debate about whether the benefits have been commensurate with the costs.
Jeremy, when that invasion occurred, I was working in Britain, and the British lost 179 servicemen, with roughly 3,500 wounded. And yet today, Prime Minister Tony Blair is reviled. He can barely walk down a street without being abused. And yet when I compare the treatment of him and his government with the way people and leaders in this country appear to have won senior positions in think tanks and continue with their publications, there doesn't seem to be much of a reckoning for those who took this nation into a war that, as Mike has just said, has cost such a large amount in terms of life.
Right. I mean, people like Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith should not be able to show their faces in public in this country without being confronted with what they did to Iraq. I mean, the reality is, and I mean, you know, having spent time in Iraq throughout the 90s, you know, many of the Iraqis I knew are dead. Many of the Iraqis that survived the war are displaced, along with the millions of others that have been displaced. But I think it's important, you know, we as Americans don't often study history as much as we should, to remember that I don't see this as the 10th anniversary of the Iraq War. This was a war that started in 1991 and was waged consistently by the United States, and it was a bipartisan war. Bill Clinton presided over the longest sustained bombing campaign since Vietnam, bombing Iraq once every 3 days under the guise of these so-called no-fly zones. He imposed the most brutal regime of economic sanctions in history on the Iraqi people, and it was disproportionately aimed at the people and not the regime. I mean, Martin, if you went into hospitals in Iraq in the 90s, they were like death rows for infants, and that was a Democratic-led administration. Then we had the non-debate in the lead up to the war, where the current Vice President, Joe Biden, was chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We were begging him. I was with one of the former heads of the UN in Iraq, Hans von Spanik, begging Joe Biden to call him as a witness to talk about the lack of WMDs in Iraq. They refused. So there are key members of this administration, the Secretary of State, John Kerry, the Vice President, Joe Biden, who also have to answer for their role in this. But people like Wolfowitz, Cheney, Rumsfeld should not be given any kind of honor in this society. They should be held accountable for the U.S. soldiers that were killed, and also, and I think it's many more than 100,000 Iraqis that were killed.
I'm sure. Mike, former Bush speechwriter David Frum has written a column in which he reveals long conversations held in 2002 between Dick Cheney and Ahmed Chalabi. And according to Frum, these two men talked less about promoting democracy and more about how Iraq might become a source of oil to the United States. Mike, was cheap oil really at the heart of this invasion?
You know, I wouldn't go that far, Martin, but I would say that fears that the Persian Gulf could be disrupted by Saddam and oil therefore become much more expensive were certainly part of it. I think, you know, I'm not a huge fan of most of the folks from the Bush administration myself, but I do think that someone like Dick Cheney did not fundamentally seek to expand American influence, you know, imperialistically or go for big oil profits for his companies. I think he was genuinely worried about what someone like Saddam Hussein could do in power. Now, you could say he made the wrong call. You could say his fears were overblown. And I certainly do not agree with the way he talked about his concerns to the American people. I think there was a hyping of the threat and a willingness to associate Saddam with 9/11, which was never justifiable. But I think that Cheney was motivated by a certain fear of what Saddam could do to that neighborhood, as opposed to looking for profits for oil companies per se.
Jeremy, just to Mike's point, yeah. Saddam had previously used chemical weapons on his own people. This wasn't a man without a record of dangerous and despotic actions.
At Saddam's most brutal, he was considered an ally of the United States. Reagan's administration lifted him from the list of state sponsors of terror, then sold him weapons that he in turn then used on Iraqi Kurds. Donald Rumsfeld met with Saddam Hussein and gave him a pair of cowboy spurs as a gift from Ronald Reagan. I saw them when I went to the Saddam Museum in Baghdad a few months before the war started. I mean, these guys came to power, the neocons came to power with an agenda for regime change in Iraq, and on 9/11 they were salivating. General Hugh Shelton, who was chair of the Joint Chiefs at the time, told me that Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, all of these guys just started Iraq, Iraq, Iraq immediately at the first meeting after 9/11. And you know, the fact is that these guys had a mission to try to redraw the maps of the Middle East. That's a fact. And Dick Cheney did not invent the idea of the executive branch being a dictatorship when it comes to foreign policy in America. Unfortunately, President Obama has continued some of the things that Cheney and Rumsfeld and these guys laid the groundwork for earlier. But my God, I mean, Cheney headed up Halliburton for the 1990s. He had oil on the mind all the time. And the irony is the U.S. isn't winning the oil in Iraq. Those guys failed at their own game, the neocons.
Mike, as you look forward at from Iraq's current position into the future, what are your expectations for that nation?
It's a great question, Martin, and it's the crucial question as we think about this day. I was just on a TV show with Foreign Minister Zabari of Iraq, and he was very disappointed in his own colleagues in their inability to compromise on key issues about Iraq's future. And he is worried about future violence in Iraq and all the violence today that you mentioned in your intro. But I think Iraqi leaders ultimately have been chastised enough by what they've seen in the course of their lives, in the course of the last 10 years, that my hope, I don't want to go quite so far as to say my expectation, but my hope is that they will pull back from the brink, and that, frankly, the last 5 years, as ugly as they've been, have been better than the 5 years before that. And I do expect gradual, slow progress in Iraq. I think it's going to be a long time before that is a truly stable country. But I'm going to stay hopeful because there are enough Iraqis that I believe in that I think they'll find a way.
Let's hope so. Michael O'Hanlon and Jeremy Scahill. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Stay with us. Thanks, much more ahead.